Good afternoon and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. We have a nice large turnout today, and I know many of you are here because you've heard today's guest, Ilan Berman, before. This is his third appearance with the JPC, and we are really thrilled to have him. Before we get to the program, you get your JPC commercial. JPC was established in 1985 as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles, our magazine In Focus Quarterly, and our blog In Context. We have a pattern. The upcoming issue of In Focus will be out at the end of this month. It's our annual Israel issue. We're running fast to keep up with events, and I think you will find our cast of authors diverse, fascinating, and really instructive when we get there. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them, especially Iran, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center politically, we advocate for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. In this series of calls, and it's been going on now for quite a while, we've been trying to provide background to the events of the day. In the beginning, we leaned heavily on the impact of the Wuhan virus on the internal and foreign policy choices, both of America's friends and of America's adversaries. Iran is on that second list, and how Iran proceeds financially, militarily, and politically, both at home and abroad, will help to determine the course of Middle East events for years to come. So we spend a lot of time on Iran. The Abraham Accords broadened our interest in the Persian Gulf states and North Africa, and we're going to start there today, focusing on Morocco and its relations with the United States and China. And we're going to move from there, and I imagine we'll hit Iran and a couple of other things. Our guest, Ilan Berman, is widely traveled in the region, and he brings a wealth of information on regional trends and regional actors. Remember, listeners, you are muted, but you can send your questions on our Q&A function. We'll be listening. And now I'd like to introduce Ilan Berman, who is the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C., an expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. He has consulted for the CIA, as well as the Departments of State and Defense, and provided assistance on foreign policy and national security to a range of government agencies and congressional offices. Ilan is also a member of the associated faculty at Missouri State University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. A frequent writer and commentator, he's written for the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times. I think he has to rethink writing for the New York Times at this point. Foreign Policy, the Washington Post, USA Today, and others, and he is a frequent guest on radio and television. He is the author of several books, including Iran's Deadly Ambition, The Islamic Republic's Quest for Global Power, and Tehran Rising, Iran's Challenge to the United States. And I suspect that even if we don't start with Iran, we're going to get to Iran. My personal favorite is a slightly older book that Ilan has written, which is Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America. And maybe that will be our next call. Most recently, he is the author of The Fight for Iran, Opposition Politics, Protest, and the Struggle for the Soul of a Nation. And I will tell you, I'm reviewing it in Focus in the summer issue. So take a peek. Ilan Berman, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Shoshana, and thanks for the plug. I really appreciate it. I very often feel like I write and I sort of throw things out into the ether, so it's always nice to when people are sort of reading it and seeing it. Always nice to be with you. I look forward to the day we can do this in person. I feel a little strange wearing a blazer in my basement. However, I have been traveling, and actually the topic that we're going to talk about today came about because you and I had been talking for a number of weeks, because last month or 2 months ago now, I got a chance to travel to Morocco. And it was sort of a little bit of an inside baseball sort of trip, because I have a longstanding relationship with the foreign minister, and I know folks at the embassy well, and so it was it wasn't general travel. It was sort of, I was asked whether I wanted to come, and like most of you, I very stir crazy at that time. I'm sure still now. And so I jumped at the opportunity to go, and I was delighted that I did. First of all, because I had tremendous access, because they hadn't seen an American in over a year, and so they were very eager to talk. But also because when I went there was a tremendous amount going on. There's still a tremendous amount going on, but lots of it is going on almost entirely under the radar. There's not a lot of understanding of sort of the dynamics that are happening in North Africa in particular. Some of this has changed since then, and so I'll talk about it and then I'll update. And some of it is exactly the same. So, but it's useful to sort of to get a temperature reading of where we were, where we are, and where we're going. So the alpha and the omega of Moroccan politics generally is the Western Sahara, the territory that the former Spanish territory that the Moroccans have administered since the mid 1970s. It depends on which maps you look at, but for a long time internationally, the territory was considered as a frozen conflict. The sovereignty was contested, even though the kingdom has been the only game in town in terms of providing social services, in terms of providing investment, in terms of development, and allowing for this sort of advanced autonomy solution, right? Where the Western Sahara is nominally part of the kingdom, but in general is mostly a self-governing province. This formula was really solidified in Morocco's favor in December, so just a few months ago, when the outgoing Trump administration made Morocco, or facilitated Morocco's entry into the group of Abraham Accords countries, and Morocco normalized relations with Israel, and in tandem with that, the Trump administration granted a sort of formal U.S. recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara. So this is a huge deal for Moroccan national interests, because I think people who don't spend a lot of time in Morocco don't fully appreciate the degree to which the Western Sahara is a national enterprise. It's a sort of a national identity enterprise. There's many Moroccans, there's 37 million Moroccan citizens. Many of them still have relatives who are living, who individually, personally marched down to what they call the Southern Territories to stake a claim politically in the aftermath of Spain's retraction. And every Moroccan, left, right, and center that you talk to, they talk about the Western Sahara and Morocco's claim to it as a source of national pride, and it's something that they're willing to fight over. And that's useful to remember, because it's something that demolishes the myth that has swirled around the Abraham Accords and the Trump administration's place in it, which is that, oh, this was just this sort of cynical quid pro quo that was given to the Moroccans, to facilitate their engagement with Israel. Frankly, that's not the case. And the relations with Israel are longstanding. There's something like roughly 1 million Jews of Moroccan descent, Moroccan origin, who now live in Israel. So, and there's been economic ties for decades, right? Since the exodus of that community from Morocco in the 1950s and 1960s. So the idea that this was sort of new and cut from whole cloth is certainly not the case. This was something that was in motion for a long time. It just sort of broke into the open at the tail end of the Trump administration. But the Western Sahara is a huge piece here, and it's a huge piece in particular because when I went there in April, it was in motion. The Biden administration, as part of its foreign policy, was doing with Morocco the way it was doing with a number of other countries, this comprehensive review of policy. And the jury was still out as to whether or not Morocco was going to still be recognized as the sovereign of the Western Sahara. There was, Moroccans were cautiously optimistic. When I talked to this whole panoply of government officials, they were cautiously optimistic that that judgment would be upheld, but there were no guarantees for them. And frankly, they hadn't had a lot of contact with the Biden administration up until then, so they didn't really know what to think. So the good news, such as it is that since then, the Moroccans have received the answer that they were looking for, which is that the Biden administration has upheld, at least for now, the decision. But it comes with a number of not insignificant caveats. So the U.S. continues to formally recognize Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, but and this is a big but. The administration doesn't seem to have an appetite for solidifying that claim in any way. So, for example, there were plans that were mooted at the very end of the Trump administration to establish a physical consulate in the Western Sahara, sort of a physical U.S. diplomatic presence in the Western Sahara. Those are tabled. There are signals that the Moroccans can't really rely on any significant funding for a real U.S. Diplomatic presence. The U.S. is not incentivizing American companies to go into the Western Sahara. And frankly, all of this matters, and it matters a great deal because we're not the only game in town. So one of the really interesting things to watch, which I'll talk about in a minute, is where Morocco fits in the unfolding great power competition between the United States and China, because the Western Sahara is an inviting strategic prize. It has a port that needs to be developed. The Chinese and various Chinese companies have already made noises about reaching out to the kingdom and helping develop the southern port of Dakhla, which is the main city in the Western Sahara. It's something that we really haven't considered yet, and maybe it's because we're under this administration a bit timid in talking about the Abraham Accords and normalization, but it's also sort of part of a larger strategic game that's unfolding, and that the Moroccans are watching, and increasingly not so much from the sidelines. And that was sort of the second big takeaway that I had when I went there. I managed to spend a day and a half going up to the north of the country to the Mediterranean coast and visiting their big port project called Tangermed, which is, some of you may have heard of it, but generally it's sort of flown under the radar, but it's the culmination of this enormously ambitious economic strategy to position Morocco as this transshipment hub of goods coming from Europe, as well as of goods that come from Europe that will be distributed in Africa throughout the continent. And it's an enormously impressive facility. It's got massive container capacity. It ranks in the top 20 global ports. Excuse me. And but it's also increasingly important in terms of how the U.S. thinks about global supply chains, because over the last year, and obviously, like every other port and shipment facility, Tangermed has been impacted by COVID-19, but it also has positioned Morocco in this really interesting place where the Moroccans want very much to be on the sideline of the great power competition unfolding between the United States and China. But increasingly, as the U.S. thinks about diversifying supply chains, as the U.S. thinks about decoupling from its traditional reliance on Asian ports, in particular on sort of Chinese ports, places like Tangermed become increasingly important. And so the Moroccans may talk about being an impartial third party to great power competition, but their whole economic construct is propelling them to be a fairly significant part of the way we think about supply chains, the way we think about container security and things like that moving forward. And they know this. And there's sort of an interesting sidebar here too, because Tangermed is built. The follow-on facility, which is about 100 kilometers down the same coastline, is being built currently, but that facility isn't oriented against, well, they would say that Tangermed is not oriented against anybody, but that facility called Nador is actually a hydrocarbon storage facility, which is interesting because Morocco has not sort of traditionally been a transshipment hub of any significance, but hydrocarbons coming from, places like Libya become significant and increasingly significant in the conversation about Europe's energy security, because Europe is enormously reliant on Russian energy, and may soon be even more so because of the imminent completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And so the Moroccans are not talking great power competition, but they're positioning themselves to be a big player in the competition with China, and a couple of years down the line, maybe in the competition with Russia as well. So it's sort of a very interesting dynamic to watch. But Shoshana, you mentioned Iran, so we're going to get there, because the third basket, I think, that was super significant to me was the way the Moroccans were thinking about regional security. And when I talked to high-ranking Moroccan officials, they, to a man, to a woman, they said what I had been sort of reading in the press, which is that Africa is very much in play in terms of extremist activity, in terms of Islamist activity. They're seeing an uptick in terms of activities by the Islamic State and affiliated radicals who have begun to exploit in earnest the Sahel region, the lawless desert area that sits under what we call North Africa, that is this historic transshipment transit hub for drugs and weapons and human trafficking. And increasingly, there's a presence of ISIS there. You're seeing this migration of extremism further down, further south into the continent, to link up with radicals that are operating in places like Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. And so there's a lot of concern that they had in terms of Sunni extremism, but they also had a lot of concern in terms of Shiite extremism as well. And one of the the most eyebrow-raising things that I heard was the degree to which they were concerned about what they saw as a new level of Iranian activism in Africa. And I had one official tell me, if I'm sort of paraphrasing correctly, I'm not sure I can remember the exact quote, but he said something along the lines of, it is no longer possible to talk about Iranian activity just in West Africa. They are all over the continent. And I found that an interesting comment, and I asked him what he meant by this. He said, look, what we're seeing increasingly is Iranian sub-state activity, leveraging very much the same way that a decade ago Iran was trying to do in places like Latin America, leveraging Lebanese diaspora communities all over Africa, setting up cultural centers, setting up, trying to create a permissive political environment, permissive economic environment to skirt sanctions. But, and this is a big but, what I heard from more than one official, high-ranking official in Morocco, was that this activity has experienced a pretty significant uptick over the last year. In particular, they said, since January of 2020, we're really concerned with what we're seeing in terms of Iranian activism. And that data is important because what they were saying in a subtle way was that Iran has stepped up its activities in Africa in the wake of the January 2020 killing of Qasem Soleimani, which suggests that what Iran is doing in Africa is not just a general purpose advancing its own economic and political position, but may have concrete consequences in terms of Iranian targeting of not only of American interests, but also of American allies, including Morocco. So all politics is local. The Moroccans are worried about the local manifestations of this, but it provides some really good, I think, situational awareness that, quite frankly, the White House isn't paying attention to, because we're so focused on getting back to the 2015 JCPOA and throwing a Hail Mary and assuming that re-entry is going to create some sort of follow-on longer and stronger agreement. Candidly, there's no evidence that that's actually going to happen, and there's no evidence that the Iranians want this. But in the service of our diplomatic re-engagement, we're missing a lot of things, including the level of Iranian activity that's increasing in Africa and what the practical strategic consequences for that are. So I'll stop there.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. I had to be sure we could talk here. Okay, so you've raised a few questions. We have some questions from listeners, and I have some questions. So the killing of Soleimani clearly had ramifications in Iran and in the IRGC and in its ability to do certain things. Is Africa the sort of second choice of where Iran would spend its energies, as opposed to perhaps having lost Soleimani, not being able to have as much influence in the Sunni Middle East where it had been working, number one. And number two, does the Biden administration, that's a year later, but does the entry of the Biden administration and the loosening of funds have anything to do with this?
So I think the second one first, because it's there's a logical train to this. I think, to me, the fatal flaw, and there's lots of problems and demerits with the 2015 nuclear deal, but to me, the fatal flaw, sort of the core problem with the JCPOA, was the fact that the economic dividends for Iran were so significant that it didn't compel the Iranian regime to make any hard strategic choices. We gave them so much money, we liberalized their economy so much that it allowed them to pursue all these different avenues in terms of foreign adventurism that they were pursuing before. They didn't have to pick and choose what they wanted. And I think the Iranians are at least anticipating that this is the trend line that's emerging now. And so, if anything, the foreign adventurism in Africa is strategic because it's a response to Soleimani, right? Revenge is a dish best served cold. and they're thinking about how to better position themselves in the region. But I can only imagine that what they're doing regionally in Africa is going to be strengthened and bolstered by the laissez-faire attitude that the administration has exhibited so far with regard to Iranian proxies and Iranian proxy and asymmetric activities on the one hand, and second of all, bolstered by the expected dividend of re-entry into the JCPOA, the expected dividend of what the administration is prepared to give them in order to coax them back to the negotiating table. And we're beginning to see this already. What's interesting, the interesting interplay here is that the administration is both honest and deceptive when it talks about the fact that it won't lift sanctions until Iran comes back into compliance. It's honest because there has been no formal rescindment of sanctions, including executive order sanctions. It is deceitful because
we had a glitch. We had a glitch
Sorry.
in your response. Can you repeat that?
So it's honest because the administration hasn't moved to formally roll back executive orders and congressional restrictions and congressional pressure. It is deceitful because you can do a lot in terms of signaling to Iran that you're prepared to do this by simply, for example, relaxing enforcement of existing sanctions, or by offering $1 billion in humanitarian aid as the confidence building measure, right? So the writing's on the wall as far as the Iranians are concerned. And I would have to imagine that this level of activity that the Iranians are pursuing in places like Africa is going to be bolstered. I mean, Iran is in Africa because it has a permissive atmosphere, right? I mentioned Latin America before. The Iranian strategic project in Latin America is often very hard to understand because, well, frankly, there's not a lot of Muslims there, and there's even less Shiites there. And so what they were trying to do was much more a sort of a third world dialogue with ideologically compatible regimes, right? The Hugo Chavez, now the Nicolas Maduro regime in Venezuela. Oh, and by the way, something to watch in coming days is there's an Iranian warship that is apparently sailing to Venezuela as we speak, and it should arrive just a few days before the Iranian elections on June 18th as a signal of ideological solidarity with the Maduro regime, but also, frankly, as something very important, which is, the Iranians for years have been talking about the fact that they're a strong military and they're building a blue water naval presence. And what better proof of concept for a blue water naval presence than to be able to sail a warship into the Western Hemisphere and not have anybody do anything about it. So that's an aside, but something to watch. But all of this, I think, they're not recreating this anew, right? Everything that they're doing in Africa is what they were doing a decade ago, 12 years ago in Latin America. They're just doing more of it, and it's a more permissive environment because there's more Muslims, there's more Shiites, there's, frankly, the Lebanese communities are more robust, and so it's much closer to home base for them.
Thank you. Question, returning us to Morocco and the Western Sahara. First of all, has there been a downside to the United States for having done it, having done the recognition? And secondly, where are the Europeans on this? It had been the case that none of the European countries accepted Western Sahara as part of Morocco. Right. Has any of that changed? And what's the dynamic going on now for us and for the Europeans?
Right. Well, it's interesting because the Europeans, so we're not fully on board with Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara under the Biden administration, right? This is being portrayed, at least in some way, as a Trump administration initiative. It's something that the Biden administration thought about reconsidering, may still reconsider in the future, but in the meantime is using as a sort of a lever to get the Moroccans to talk more to the Polisario, which is the leftist separatist independence movement that Algeria abets, to talk to its geopolitical rival Algeria, and as part of a international peace process and a set of negotiations. That's something the Europeans back very much, but from an American strategic advantage perspective, I actually think it's really harmful. Not because there shouldn't be more dialogue, right? There should always be more dialogue, but because an American recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, when the Europeans are not quite on the same page, confers first mover advantage to American companies that can actually go into the territory and set up shop in a way that advantages American interests. The more we recognize it but don't exploit it, the more we take a back seat in terms of driving the political process, the more we lose that strategic advantage. And so that's what I worry about. I worry about a sort of a U.S. approach to the Western Sahara that's neither here nor there. It sort of grandfathers in the Trump era recognition, but we confer to ourselves none of the benefits of having taken that stand in the first place.
So China, it seems, is better at taking advantage of openings, wigglings, spaces than we are. And you talked about China, excuse me, China and Morocco. There's also a question of Chinese ports in Israel. And you said something very interesting to me when we were discussing it on the side. Can you compare the Chinese port construction in Haifa to the Chinese interest in the ports in Morocco?
Sure. And as you know,
as they relate to American interests.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you know, it's the sort of the Chinese penetration in Israel has sort of been a hobby horse of mine for a long time. And I have to tell you, candidly, the Moroccans have been much smarter about this than the Israelis have. What you have in at least at the Tanger Med facility, it's not just a port, it's a free trade industrial zone. There is a Chinese presence there. They have limited the Chinese presence to some percentage fraction of overall industrial product, even though overall industrial development, even though the Chinese have wanted more. This is not something that's taken place in Israel. In fact, the U.S. national security establishment for a long time was very concerned about Shanghai Ports World, which is this Chinese government-linked port entity that the Israeli Interior Ministry signed a deal with back in 2015 to rehabilitate and upgrade and then to oversee day-to-day operations in Haifa, right? And that's significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it gives the Chinese a bird's eye view on a tremendous amount of commercial activity, right? And so the Israelis should have a decision. But frankly, more strategically, it gives a lot of pause to the most durable prong of Israel's foreign policy, which is its strategic special relationship with the United States. Because more and more U.S. naval officials, for example, have said, we're really concerned by, the ability of the Chinese government by proxy to sort of to look over our shoulders, to watch military maneuvers, to sort of to watch the integration that we have with the Israelis. So it's interesting because Israel has, the way I understand it, Israel has sort of bought hook, line, and sinker the idea that it is a startup nation. And make no mistake, it is a startup nation. But in the quest to get other countries to recognize that it's a startup nation, they've accepted a lot of capital, including in particular from China, in a way that may have adverse medium to long-term consequences on other things that the Israelis care about. And this is something that the Israelis, frankly, have been a little slow to roll back. There's a new national security committee that was established at the Israeli National Security Council about 18 months ago, mirroring, at the request, by the way, of the Trump administration, mirroring what we have at the United States called CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is a committee, interagency committee to judge the strategic impact of investments and whether or not we should allow these to go forward. But the Israeli government has in this committee, they have a huge multi-billion-dollar carve out for Israel's tech sector, because Israel's tech sector is very dynamic and it wants to attract as much foreign capital as possible. Of course, the problem here is that a lot of the tech sector is involved in dual-use defense industrial projects that have implications for the United States. So this is a conversation, frankly, that's ongoing. It's something that I think the Trump administration flagged, and rightly so, very significantly with their Israeli counterparts. I have no idea whether the Biden administration is willing to pursue this thread. They certainly should, especially as they get serious about great power competition, right? Israel plays a big part here. The Moroccans are, as I said, I think better positioned in this regard. They understand the worries about sort of the worries and the problems that may arise by allowing the Chinese too big of a foothold, too big of an entry. The problem is they don't have as many choices as Israel does, right? If there is no question of sovereignty over Haifa, there's a question of sovereignty over the Western Sahara. And if the United States and the European Union is not willing to invest in building up infrastructure, willing to invest in ports, the Chinese are the only game in town. So from our national security perspective, we would be well served to think about it in that context. Morocco is very much a sort of partner that is in play in the context of great power competition.
In terms of our national security, I would simply point out that the Chinese have a military base in Djibouti, which is right next to our military base in Djibouti, which is our only permanent military presence in Africa. So the United States may be behind in more than one track here. You know, you've got to look at the Red Sea as well as the Mediterranean. A question from a listener. How secure is Morocco? What is the status of terrorist groups in the country? There's Al-Qaeda, the Islamic Maghreb. You know, how good a hold does the king have on the country, and particularly its outlying areas?
So that's a really interesting question, and I've puzzled over this for a long time, because Morocco internally is very stable, it's very secure. You know, incidents, I mean, there's significant economic disparities, but incidents of crime are relatively small, especially compared to other places in Africa. But at the same time, Moroccan origin extremists are very highly represented. They're very highly represented in the ranks of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, for example, right? There's a real concern there. So the question is, how do you square those two? I can tell you this, at least from my observations. First of all, one of the key steps that the Moroccans have taken is that anybody who they've criminalized jihadist activity abroad, meaning any Moroccan who has left Morocco to join ISIS in Iraq and Syria is ipso facto a criminal, and therefore they don't come back and enter into general population, they come back and go to prison, right? So a lot of them don't come back. Those that do come back into prison, they're put in this separate incarceration track where, you know, there's a lot of rehabilitation work that's done with them. They're very closely watched. So this is how the Moroccans are mitigating the risk. But that second part is precisely what your listener talked about, which is the credibility of the monarch, right? The King of Morocco is one of very few leaders in the Muslim world that can trace his lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad. And that gives him something that people like Tunisia's Ben Ali or Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, you know, when they were empowered, just didn't have, which is at least some flexibility and legitimacy in interpreting correct Quranic scripture, right? The correct interpretation of Quranic scripture. And so the king, as long as he's legitimate, and for right now he's, his popularity is very high, has the ability to push back intellectually against very extreme interpretations of Islam in a way, frankly, other regional leaders don't. And this is actually sort of, I think, a really interesting dynamic to watch. It's something that you see sort of duplicated in places like Jordan, for example, although less effectively. But if the United States is still serious about, the war of ideas, sort of the battle for hearts and minds in the Muslim world, and I would argue should be, looking at places like Morocco that have sort of managed to straddle this line, that have used this historical context to add legitimacy to themselves and to push extremist interpretations of the faith to the side, frankly, that's a really good bet.
Which may have given the king of Morocco the standing that he needed to go to the Abraham Accords, as you mentioned. And not only the Accords, but as you said, there's always been trade and travel between Morocco and Israel. I actually had a niece who lived in Morocco for 2 years, bringing Israeli tourists to come and visit the homeland, the historical places. We tend to hear more about Israel and the UAE, or Israel and Bahrain, in terms of development and social relations. How's it going with Morocco?
So I think it's going very well. One of the really interesting things to watch in the region, in the context of the Abraham Accords, is the degree to which all of these countries, the core signatories, as well as other countries like Saudi Arabia that were sort of on deck to sign up for this trend, the way they managed to solidify this independent of the United States, right? Because the idea under the Trump administration was all in. The Trump administration was very interested in formalizing and solidifying and sort of continuing the trend. The Biden administration seems charitably far less interested in doing so. In fact, so much so that it's as I hear it, it's hard to utter the phrase Abraham Accords at the National Security Council these days without getting strange looks. So where the rubber meets the road for me is whether these countries can solidify the ties independently, not relying on the United States, not letting the US set the pace, because the US is no longer setting the pace for this. And in this context, I was enormously heartened by the fact that Morocco and Israel I mean, you've heard a lot more about, as you said, about the UAE and Israel and Bahrain and Israel, but Morocco and Israel have established a permanent, exchanged ambassadors. They're establishing in the next several weeks, they're establishing formal embassy compounds in each other's capitals. And although I think they might be setting up a Moroccan embassy in Tel Aviv, not Jerusalem, right? But it's a different conversation. They just announced earlier this week, they announced direct flights between Marrakesh and Tel Aviv. And so all of the nuts and bolts and the administrative guts of what normalization looks like seems to be proceeding, and it seems to be proceeding independently. And I think that's actually a really powerful commentary on how normalization makes good strategic sense for both countries, irrespective of what the US does, right? It's just it's the natural culmination of a trend that's been building for a long time. So I'm very bullish on this in general. I think, quite frankly, there's going to be growing pains in all this. So one of the super fascinating sidebar conversations I had when I was in Morocco was the question of a Jewish right of return, right? Because one of the things which is, by the way, something you never hear about, certainly outside the kingdom, but the idea that you have a very significant Jewish diaspora that left in the 1950s and 1960s, anticipating persecution at the time of the Six-Day War and things like that. And they left property that has since been nationalized. And now there are Moroccans, Muslim Moroccans, who live in these, in these places, in places like Rabat. And so, not saying that it's going to be a future problem, but something at least worth thinking about is the degree to which there are sort of residual claims that these people may have on territories that they left or their ancestors left. And it's something that the Moroccans are beginning to think about and think through. And as they begin to normalize, it becomes more of an actual issue. The question of, we definitely want Moroccan origin tourists from Israel to come visit, but we don't want them to stake a claim to past territories, right? So there's lots of analogies that sort of go back and forth here, but it's a level of conversation that, quite frankly, wasn't even possible 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So I think the trend line in the main is very, very positive.
Although I have to say that President Clinton in the Oslo Accord days, I mean, the late and not lamented Oslo Accords mostly, did talk about compensation for Jews who had left Arab countries, as he talked about compensation for Palestinians who left what became the state of Israel, because he was trying to move the conversation from a physical right of return for Palestinians to Israel, which was a non-starter for Israel, to something broader and possibly more acceptable. And so maybe we're actually going to go back to the future. Maybe there will be a conversation about reparations. I have trouble imagining too many Israelis and their descendants wanting to move back to Morocco.
No, right.
It could be a place to go. And all of this has survived the Hamas war against Israel in May. However, somebody writes in to say that the Moroccan foreign minister expressed strong support for Hamas in May during the conflict, in contrast with the UAE and Bahrain. Do you think that's significant, or is that a throwaway?
So I think that's a throwaway generally, and not just because I know him, nice guy generally, but also because I'm very aware, very sensitive to the sort of the position that Morocco has. So what you have is this really interesting balancing act that's happening in Morocco. So on the one hand, you have a government that is very attuned to the strategic benefits of normalization with Israel. At the same time, for whatever reason, you have a Moroccan street that's very attuned to the Palestinian cause. There's 70-75% approval for renewed Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, for greater Palestinian rights, whatever it is, to the point where Morocco now chairs the Al-Quds Committee, which is the Palestinian Committee at the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And so for the kingdom, it's this constant balancing act between pursuing strategic interests over the long term and being responsive to their own street. And I see the official rhetoric coming out of Morocco as being part of that. I would note that the Moroccans have, during the recent conflict, the Moroccans studiously avoided being dragged in, as the State Department tried to do, dragged in to be a mediator between Israel and Hamas. They wanted no part of it. And they wanted no part of it because they understand that it's a losing proposition. And so I would try a little bit to separate the rhetoric from the reality, because my sense is that the Moroccan position is rhetorically, reflexively, sort of, along those lines, sort of supportive of Palestinians generally, maybe even of Hamas in particular. But what they do practically matters much more. And, my sense is, talk is cheap.
Yeah, I thought opening the air corridor after the May war was a good sign of where the Moroccans were going. They could have said, it's not politically feasible right now, but they didn't, and they went ahead and it's open. So, okay. So we're going to come soon to the end of our conversation because I promised you an out at 12:45. And as listeners know, I like to ask a question at the end, the response to which is a positive answer from you, because I want to end this on a positive note. So we talked a little bit before the program about Morocco and COVID-19. So could you talk to us about Morocco and COVID-19? How are they doing? What do they need from us? What do they want from us? What do they think they're not going to get from us? Us meaning us, not
Right.
meaning the United States specifically, but the Western world, the first world, or from China. Who's going to step in and help them?
Although I would say that having the U.S. be a little bit more bullish on vaccine diplomacy, the way the Russians are and the Chinese are, would actually be a really good thing, because we can do it, and it would burnish our bona fides with a whole host of countries, right? India first among them, but not only. But it's interesting because Morocco is 37 million people or so. It's roughly a tenth of the United States. When I went there in April, they were about 10-12% vaccinated. Their choices are AstraZeneca and one of the Chinese variants. I believe it's Sinopharm. But what I heard from a number of people is, we don't know, we can't see our way out of this yet. And I found that an interesting statement, and I sort of delved down and I asked them, I said, why? They said, well, one of the things that we're experiencing is that other countries, better resourced countries. So first of all, Morocco is by the way, much better positioned than the rest of Africa. Generally, they're doing much better because of their proximity to Europe and because of sort of the dynamism of their economy compared to other, sub-Saharan African states, for example. But nonetheless, they can't see a way out of the pandemic because, as I heard, better resourced countries in Europe are getting in line ahead of them. Right, they're willing to pay more for vaccines. They're willing to to do better outreach to pharmaceutical companies, or in the context of China, to to state-owned enterprises that sort of control vaccine distribution. And so what you get is this unequal distribution of the vaccine and this unreliability of supply that they were locked down essentially for a month for Ramadan because they didn't want people to after sundown to come out and congregate and socialize. And that, I think, speaks volumes about the fragility of their recovery. And they're doing much better than Africa. So to me, what's very concerning is, Morocco's in a relatively good place, but they could be in a much better place as a result of outreach, as a result of sort of this global engagement that so far, frankly, isn't happening, and it should be.
Okay, so while you were answering the question, we got another question. So I think we're not going to end on this positive note as I wanted to, but I'm going to give you the last question anyway, because we have a couple of minutes. He writes, regardless of Islamic State, how can we truly believe that the Muslim Brotherhood will not ruin scenarios of true normalization from their constant pressure on Muslim states? So it's an Abraham Accords question. We worry about Iran and we worry about Iranian influence, but if you're a Sunni state that wants to do this, don't you have to worry about the Muslim Brotherhood? Isn't that the Hamas problem?
Well, no, and you do. And in fact, the PJD, which is the sort of the Moroccan variant of Muslim Brotherhood Light, I would say, is the dominant party in the parliament. And this is why, quite frankly, just sort of to close the circle to what I started with, the question of the Western Sahara. In Morocco, you have this really intricate interplay of the legitimacy of the monarch, these Islamist currents that are kept at bay because the monarch is in charge as long as he's seen as legitimate, and these pretty aggressive foreign policy moves that the kingdom is making that are very high reward, but also very high risk. And so, and you have an election coming up in September. And so what you get is this sort of this really interesting confluence of, if we're the United States and we're smart, and sometimes we are, sometimes we're not. But if you're the United States and we're smart and we're looking at a country that's in play like Morocco, we have to be very cognizant of the Islamist current and of things that may create greater intellectual fodder for the Islamist current, right? You can imagine that in Morocco, the Islamist current will be greatly bolstered by a narrative, by a sort of a rollback of U.S. recognition over the Western Sahara, and by a political narrative that they can promote that, oh, look, the king tried to normalize with Israel. Look what it got us. We're in a worse position vis-a-vis the United States than we were before, right? We don't, at the very least, we don't want that to happen. And so, I think it's interesting. The legitimacy of the king, at least in the context of Morocco, is, I think, a very important checker and balancer on the power and the legitimacy of Islamist forces. Nonetheless, the PJD controls the parliament, and they're likely to control the parliament after the September elections as well. But what they do and what they want to do, despite their Islamist leanings, is curtailed by these Jersey barriers of the monarchy, right? And that's a balance that, frankly, has proven very durable over the last couple of decades, but it's also not necessarily a permanent condition. So that's why I think we should always be cognizant about, how this is a conversation that's in motion.
So that's where we're going to leave it, Ilan. And it sounds to me like the United States has decisions to make. And depending on how we make them, our regional partners and our regional adversaries and our regional close allies are all going to have to account for that in shifting and complicated ways, which leads me to ask you if you'll come back again in the future and unwind the ropes for us again.
Oh, I'd be happy to. I'd love to do it. There's lots of stuff to talk about, not just with North Africa, but there's a Russia conversation coming, as you alluded to at the beginning, and lots to talk about. So I'd love to.
Great. Well, thank you for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you again.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.